Good morning. My name is Michael Smith. I'm the Minister of Music here, and I'm standing up here because Dave is out of town on a retreat, and Mother Amy is leading the Life in Christ class. So you get third string. An innovative educator and accomplished art historian, administrator, and author, Thom Collins, a Philadelphia native, has more than 20 years of experience in some of America's top art institutions, including the Perez Art Museum, Miami, the Neubauer Museum of Art in Purchase, New York, the Contemporary Museum in Baltimore, the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati, the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The gain might be a little high, Alex. Collins earned his MA in Art History from Northwestern University and his BA with honors in Art History and the History of Religion from Swarthmore College. He serves on the Board of Trustees at Swarthmore College and is a member of the Association of Art Museum Directors, the Association of Art Museum Curators, and the College Art Association. Please welcome Thom Collins.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. Every time I hear that introduction, I think I really need to rewrite the introduction. So I apologize, Michael. Thank you for making it a little spicier than it actually is. So I thought the most interesting thing we might do today is not talk about all of the controversy about the Barnes, about legal action, about rumor and innuendo, and terrible documentary films, but rather talk about something that is, I think, really relevant in this context, which is to talk about Dr. Barnes' biography as it relates to his intellectual history, which has a deep connection to spiritual practice and theology, and to talk a little bit about what we're doing with that legacy today at the Barnes Foundation. And then I promise to leave some time at the end if you do want to explore rumor and innuendo with me. I am more than happy to do that too. So thank you all for being here. I also just want to say, this is a great but challenging combination of post-church, post-snacks, and darkness. So if you see someone near you nodding off, just gently, because I can see them nodding off too. So thank you all for being here. Let's see. Here we go. So Dr. Barnes, you probably know, is a native Philadelphian. He was born in 1871 and into poverty. And this is a very important part of his story. He was really born into abject poverty. His father was very seriously injured, serving in the Civil War, and pretty much unable to work through Barnes' entire childhood. He grew up in two very rough neighborhoods, what is now Fishtown, and then the romantically named The Neck, which is now the area that is occupied by the airport. So very rough neighborhoods, but importantly, integrated neighborhoods. Working class, but integrated neighborhoods. And fortunately for Barnes, he was incredibly bright, a remarkable autodidact, and won a scholarship to Central High School. He's one of only two people in his year to enter Central High School with a scholarship. He studied at Central High School. He graduated in 3 years at the age of 17, and he immediately matriculated at Penn, where he earned his medical degree in 3 years. So by 1890, he had completed all of his training and entered clinical practice. Now, those of you that know something about Dr. Barnes can imagine that he was not the most talented clinician. A little bit of a curmudgeon, a little bit of a crank, not the most socially skilled person. He did not do very well in clinical practice. And after about a year and a half in clinical practice, he decided that what he would do instead was become involved with the early pharmaceutical industry, which, as you probably know, in the 19th century was really located in Philadelphia. It was the center of pharmaceutical experimentation and practice. And so he joined a company called Mulford, and in the early 1890s, this company sent him first to Berlin and then subsequently to Hamburg, two places where he studied pharmaceutical science. He came back to the United States, worked for Mulford for a couple of years, but quickly discovered that there was a huge opportunity for him to develop his own patents. He invited a German chemist named Hermann Hiller to come join him. They worked during the day at the same pharmaceutical company in West Philadelphia, and then in the evenings and on the weekends they would experiment with their own pharmaceutical products. The probably best known part of the Barnes story, my slides are, of course, out of order. That's an art historian's thing. I apologize. So the important piece of this story early on is that Barnes was raised principally by his mother, and I should say that his father was largely absent from the home. And the mother, like many working class people, and in the case of some populations he'd be very attached to later, also people of color, became an early acolyte to Methodism in the United States during the period of Reconstruction when Barnes was a child. So while his father was largely absent, his mother would take Dr. Barnes as a child to tent meetings, camp revivals, and so forth. And importantly, for his story, these were integrated, racially integrated camp meetings and tent revivals, and you might wonder why Methodism was the fastest growing denomination in the United States during Reconstruction, and that is precisely because they foregrounded the idea of earned salvation, right? And so for working class people, for people of color, for women, for others who found themselves on the social margins, it seemed a way to integrate. It seemed like an inviting denomination, an inviting practice, and an inviting theology. So he grew up in that environment. He then progressed through the education I just mentioned. And by the middle of the 1890s, he was, as I said, experimenting with these pharmaceutical products. By 1899, he and Hilla had developed a pharmaceutical product that you've probably heard of, which was called Argerol. And Argerol famously was used in the eyes of pretty much every newborn born in North America up until the early 1970s. It was the first antiseptic that was gentle enough to be used in the eyes, ears, nose, and throat. This is in the time before, of course, oral antibiotics, and so it was a very, very popular product. He developed Argerol with Hilla, and then in a first move that will not surprise you if you know anything about his biography and personality, he managed to force Hilla out of the business and took over the patent for Argerol himself. He set up his own factory in West Philadelphia by 1899. The factory, importantly, and this continues the sort of core themes of this talk, was populated almost entirely with African-American employees, and it was run by women. So he had a workforce that was integrated by 1900. It was not a big workforce, it was always less than 20 people. However, Argerol, the product that made him famous and a millionaire, was so easy to produce and so inexpensive to produce that he was able to compensate his workforce for a 40-hour work week while only requiring them to work 6 hours a day. So you may wonder what he did during the other 2 hours of the day. Over the course of the 1890s, as I said, he was a real autodidact, and he became very, very attached to the then emergent philosophical and psychological movement called pragmatism. And for those of you that are fans of philosophy or fans of early psychology, psychoanalysis and psychology, you'll know that pragmatism was a uniquely American invention. It was a philosophical and psychological movement that was born under the leadership of people like William James, the brother of the author Henry James, who was the first psychology professor tenured in the United States at Harvard University, but also philosophers like George Santayana and most famously John Dewey, who was later best known as a philosopher of democracy and education. So Barnes, at the time that he's building this workforce, at the time that he's beginning to grow his wealth, becomes an acolyte of Williams, of Santayana, and particularly of Dewey. And so what was he doing during those 2 hours a day that he was compensating his workers in the factory but not requiring them to work? He would teach them pragmatic psychology and philosophy. Now, if you know anything about analytic psychology or the philosophy of pragmatism, you might imagine this is a huge stretch, particularly because the population he was working with was a largely undereducated population with an unpredictable preparation for the workforce. So you might imagine that he was teaching financial literacy or life skills or citizenship, civics, or whatever. But no, in fact, Barnes' idea was the best thing he could do was to have them sit there for 2 hours a day while he read them excerpts from the philosophy and analytic psychology of the pragmatists. Now, now that sounds abstract and slightly absurd on the face of it, but when you know exactly what they argued, it's even more difficult to imagine what that 2 hours was like for his audience. This is my very concise definition of pragmatism, and I'm going to give you a Dewey version in just a moment. But Pragmatism, this philosophy and its psychological component, is a movement that includes those who claim that a system of belief or a proposition about self or the world is true if it's satisfactory, if it works satisfactorily. The word work is very important here. If it works satisfactorily, that the meaning of a proposition is found to be true in the practical consequences of accepting it, and that unpractical ideas are to be rejected. As the name pragmatism would suggest, this is a movement, or two movements, that turned their back on metaphysics. They turned their back on the work of Kant and his descendants, even the empiricists. And what they argued was, the best thing we can do with a philosophical system or a psychological paradigm is teach people how to pay attention to their own metacognitive activity, how to teach them to be self-aware, and through cultivating ever higher degrees of self-awareness, to make them capable of self-improvement in any circumstance they found themselves in. It is very much a yeoman farmer kind of very, very American idea, right? So bootstraps, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, but the core idea here is that you have to cultivate self-awareness. And I would argue that Barnes' interest in pragmatism stems from his early childhood encounter with Methodism, in the context in which Methodism was argued to be the most accepting, most embracing denomination, precisely because it argued for the possibility of earned salvation. So earned salvation, cultivated self-awareness, and through that self-improvement. Right? Does that connection make sense, I hope? You'll see in a moment what Barnes did with this idea. So he's reading to his factory workers 2 hours a day from this psychology and this philosophy. I'm not entirely sure how that went down. We don't have a very good record of what actually happened in the factory, but what I do know is that they were wildly productive and he was wildly successful, and by 1901 he was a millionaire. So $1 million in 1901 is about $750,000 in today's currency. So he was already doing quite well by 1901. He owned the patent, he ran the company, and so he began to kick back and enjoy a little bit of his leisure. So he's still teaching in the factory, but he has women actually running the factory for him, and these women later were the women who also ran his foundation. So he steps back and he really digs into this study of pragmatic philosophy and psychology, and he, so much so that he actually begins taking courses with John Dewey, who was a philosophy professor at Columbia, and he would commute to Columbia to take to these seminars with Dewey. And Dewey, of course, most famously wrote Democracy and Education, was published in 1916, and this gives you some idea of what appealed to Barnes. Dewey wrote, "Inquiry should not be understood as consisting of a mind passively observing the world and drawing from this ideas that, if true, correspond to reality, but rather as a process which initiates with a check or obstacle to successful human action, proceeds to active manipulation of the environment to test hypotheses, and issues in a readaptation of organism to environment that allows once again for human action to proceed." Right? This is the core pragmatic notion about human progress, both individual and collective. So, Barnes is enjoying his leisure. Barnes is more or less printing money in this factory, which he is very hands-off after a certain time. And by the end of the first decade of the 20th century, he is doing something that will not surprise you, which is he is trying to elevate himself by becoming better integrated into mainline society in Philadelphia. He has his wealth, he has his academic bona fides, he has his business pedigree, but he does not have the mainline pedigree, right? So he tries a number of strategies in that first decade to integrate himself, to ingratiate himself with the mainline. My favorite was attempting to join the fox hunt. He joined the Rose Tree Hunt Club. Have you ever seen anyone that looked less comfortable on a horse? This is Albert Barnes. And he went so far as to actually name the fox hunting cup at the Rose Tree Hunt Club, which is still, I believe, named for his wife, Laura Barnes, whom he had married in that first decade of the 20th century. When that didn't work, and it didn't work for reasons I alluded to earlier, again, not a warm and fuzzy guy, he paid careful attention to the way in which his business attorney, who was a gentleman called John G. Johnson, whose name may be familiar to some of you, it should be, his lawyer was John G. Johnson, and he was very careful to attend to the ways in which Johnson himself, who had also elevated himself through business success, his business acumen, and so forth, through his entrepreneurial activity, and he watched Johnson use the incredible collection of European art that he had accumulated over his lifetime, use that as a kind of chip to work his way into Philadelphia society, which he did rather successfully, but I think he was clearly a more socially skilled, empathetic, and articulate person than Dr. Barnes, who was more of a kind of grunt and yell person. So what he does is he watched Johnson use this collection development as a way to integrate himself and to ingratiate himself. And he recalled that he had attended Central High School with the great modernist painter William Glackens. Glackens, in that same period, had graduated, gone off to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and become the most distinguished American modernist painter of his time. Barnes reached out to him in 1911 and said, "I'm interested in collecting some of this art, some of this progressive art that you are for which you are an advocate and the leading spokesperson in North America." So he reached out to Glackens. It's actually a picture of Barnes several years after this. He reestablished this relationship with William Glackens, and he gave William Glackens $20,000 and asked him if he would begin a collection for himself and for his wife that they could install in their then first home in Marion. And he did. So Glackens traveled to Europe in 1911, spent most of his time in Paris, which the center, of course, of progressive art making at that time, and bought 33 paintings and works on paper and brought them back to Barnes in 1911. And those 33 paintings include Tournons sans Victoire by Cézanne. I'm starting with bottom left and clockwise. Renoir's Young Mother, Vincent van Gogh's The Postman, and on the far right, Picasso's Woman with a Cigarette, which was painted in 1901. It was probably 1901. It was probably the most recent of those pictures, and all of them wildly progressive by American artistic standards, even by Glackens standards. Glackens really associated with still working in a realist mode. The work he brought back was very, very progressive by European and American standards. So he came back to this work, and Barnes, ever the contrarian, and as I said, ever the autodidact, leaned into this work. He leaned into the idea of progress. He leaned into the idea of difficult, challenging work. It will not surprise you given the personality profile I've already conjured for you. And so he came back, and Barnes then, as he had done with pragmatic philosophy and psychology, really dug into the criticism and aesthetic philosophy associated with that progressive European art of the moment. And I'm going to read you just a quick quote from the leading spokesperson for European modernism in the moment, a guy called Roger Fry. Fry wrote of this work in an article in 1910 about the artist Cézanne. Anyone who has had the opportunity of observing modern French art cannot fail to be struck by the new tendencies. A new ambition, a new conception of the purpose and methods of painting are gradually emerging. A new hope, too, and a new courage to attempt in painting that direct expression of an imagined state of consciousness which has been relegated to music and poetry. This new concept of art, in which the decorative elements preponderate at the expense of the representative, has in it the promise of a larger and fuller life. Now, why did this idea appeal to Barnes? Well, the second part of the story of his early experience with Methodism and these camp and tent revivals, you've already heard about his interest in the idea of self-perfection, or self-improvement. The second, of course, was a comfort with and interest in the experience of people of color, in which he was immersed in that time. And the third is referenced here, which is the idea that the music that he experienced in those camp meetings and those tent revivals, he was struck by the way in which music, without representation, with no representative form at all, could elevate, could change the way we think and feel, and through that, the way we behave, through purely aesthetic elements. And so Barnes' translation of this idea, and in reference to the Fry quote, this is Barnes' book, Art and Painting in 1925, he writes, "We miss the function of a painting if we look for literate reproduction of subject matter or for information of a documentary character. Rather, we should look for the qualities that are significant, which have the power to move us aesthetically. In other words, what do we see? Not what does it represent, but what do we actually see that we can describe? And that, in his rubric, is organized around the ideas of light, line, color, and space, purely formal elements. This is going to be very important when I talk about his project. So, he's now beginning to try to ingratiate himself very actively. He's now, at this point, purchased a home in Marion, the Lapsley Arboretum, and built a home there. And he decides he is going to try to bring some of these ideas to Philadelphia. Some of these ideas of progressive art, some of these ideas of pragmatic philosophy and aesthetics, and some of these ideas about democratic education. And so the first thing he does is he begins to take paintings from his growing collection, and I should say that after 1911, Barnes did all of his own collecting after that first trip from Glackens. Glackens introduced him to his dealers and to his artist friends, including Picasso, and Modigliani, and others, and then every year, save the war years, Barnes went at least twice to Europe and collected on his own. So it was all his project after this. As I said, he really leaned into anything he was interested in. So he comes back, he has all these paintings, and Dewey says to him, why don't you start taking the painting? Dewey probably imagined how bored the employees were at the factory. So Dewey said, why don't you start taking paintings into the factory and letting them respond to the paintings, letting your workforce respond to the paintings. And again, because this was an unevenly educated population, they couldn't talk about history or mythology or predictably or literature or the history of civilization. So what did they focus on? Precisely these formal elements. He would take one painting at a time into the factory, and for 2 hours a day, the factory employees would sit there with him as a kind of moderator, talking about what they saw. That's it. Not what it meant, not what it described, not what it represented, just what they saw, breaking down the picture into its formal elements, cultivating what we now call visual literacy. So, Barnes thinks there's a real potential in bringing this progressive art to the United States, to Philadelphia, to stuffy Philadelphia. So, in 1923, he persuades the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts to exhibit 83 paintings from his then rapidly growing collection. He had about 300 paintings by 1923. And so this is just one wall hanging in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in this exhibition in 1953. I should say that Barnes already knew that he wasn't a particularly popular person in Philadelphia, so he actually attached someone else's name to this program as a curator and pretended he had nothing to do with it. Now everyone knew it was his collection, and you'll see that in a moment, but the collection was remarkable. So if you're looking at just a couple of examples, in the center, of course, is Matisse's breakthrough painting, The Joy of Life, from 1905 to 1906. On the far right, we have a great early painting by Modigliani. Third from the right is a great early painting by Picasso, and on and on and on. These are masterworks of principally French modernism. He exhibited these in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in the hopes that he could persuade Philadelphians that progressive art was important. This was the Inquirer article, Over the Fold, the day that the show opened, the day after the show opened. America's $6 million shrine for all the craziest art. How a Pennsylvania millionaire is spending a fortune to prove the futurists and cubists are not insane and teach us to admire their strange work as he does. And the article goes on to out Dr. Barnes as the collector and out Dr. Barnes as the curator, and to say that he must be deranged or that anyone would like this work was probably mentally ill. So, suffice it to say, it did not go over well, and this was a moment where Dr. Barnes really retreated. He stopped trying to ingratiate himself with Philadelphia society, and he stopped trying to influence the institutions like the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which also rebuffed him early on in his collecting. And he decided he was going to do his own thing with the support of John Dewey, and that thing that he did was to create the Barnes Foundation. He commissioned Paul Cray, who designed the Rodin Museum, among other buildings in Philadelphia. He was a faculty member at Penn, to design a gallery building for him adjacent to the home he had built for himself and his wife on the Lapsley Arboretum in Marion on Lapsley Lane. And in 1920, he incorporated the foundation in 23 as not a museum, but as an educational foundation, which is very important to the story. We're still not allowed to call it a museum. We can talk about that later. It's not great for marketing. So, in any case, so the educational foundation, and he built this building in which, with Dewey's support, he began to install the work that he continued to collect through this period in service to an educational project that he was going to sponsor, he was going to fund, and he was going to lead himself in that building, in that installation in Marion. And you're now familiar with this kind of approach to installation, which he called ensembles. From 1925 to 1930, in addition to the French modernism, he began to collect both African art and material culture and also examples of other non-Western art. And then through the remainder of his collecting career into the 1950s, early 1951 when he died, he also began to integrate great Renaissance masterpieces, Asian art, objects of design, Pennsylvania Dutch metalwork, and on and on and on, all in support of an argument that anything that he was teaching could be applied to any cultural material form, from any culture, at any time, from any place. So a kind of universal project. So he began to install the work in a way with which we're familiar, and it begins simply. So you're looking here at 3 images of the same wall over the course of 20 years or 25 years. On the left, 1927, on the right, 1928, and on the last, 1952, the year after Dr. Barnes died. And you can see over time, he continued to grow these ensembles of pictures and eventually integrating decorative arts objects and metalwork and so forth into the walls. Why? Well, and African art, famously African art. Why? He believed that if he could simply use this experience of sitting in front of one of these walls and talking about one's visual experience in a kind of nuanced way, that one could actually cultivate exactly the same kind of self-awareness, critical self-awareness, that the pragmatists argued was the most important thing that could be taught. Sitting in front of a picture, sitting in front of an ensemble of pictures and objects, and being able to speak articulately about what one sees, formally, not what it represents, but what one actually sees, one could cultivate this power of self-critical awareness, right? So, and by growing the walls, he did something very interesting. So it started with individual pictures and objects. What he started doing, many of you I'm sure have been to the Barnes, yes? So when you were there, you'll recognize that there are all these little metalworks, right, interspersed with the pictures. First of all, you'll notice that he clearly had a little bit of OCD, right? These walls are always as symmetrical as you could possibly make them. He continued to refine them over the course of years, moving pictures in and out, things in and out, to make them ever more symmetrical. But he also, when he began to introduce the metalwork, it was meant to give you clues to things that you could look for in the pictures. So, for example, if you look at the ensemble on the right, it's very difficult to see here, but the central figure is a Renoir nude whose arms are raised above her head. She's fixing her hair, and you will look on either side of this. If you were to see it, there are metalworks, door hinges, and so forth, that actually diagrammatically represent the same kind of forms of the woman with her hands over her head. I refer to it as the most expensive game of Where's Waldo that you could possibly play. You are meant to look at these ensembles and first pick the individual pieces apart, talk about them in a kind of nuanced way, and then begin to talk about what they share from picture to picture and picture to object and so forth. I think I have a great picture of this. This is one of my favorite pictures. Staring on this. Come back to the African art in a minute. So obviously collecting through the collection. So this is what these classes look like during Dr. Barnes' lifetime. This is Dr. Barnes holding court with one of his dogs, all with the same name, Fidel, with a group of students carefully selected. And what you can see is that he's sitting with his back to the window, and directly across from him is one of these ensembles. And they would literally sit for 3 hours at a time and undertake these exercises in cultivating visual literacy. I mean, a kind of remarkable thing, and the faces on the people in the class give you some sense of what that 3 hours was probably like. But in any case, he believed that this project was all, again, in service to this pragmatic ideal, and that all in service to a kind of Methodist-aligned notion about self-improvement and so forth. The African material is a very important part of this story. So I would argue that, and this is what we talk about now, when people ask us what we do relative to Dr. Barnes' legacy, I say his legacy really, I think, can be reduced to two things. One, a commitment to accessible, progressive education broadly, and the other is a real commitment to elevating people who are on the social, political, and economic margins into a kind of more embraced social life, what we now refer to as DEI and other related ethical and political postures. So Barnes was very much interested in this, and that second interest was born of his commitment to, his engagement with and commitment to the working African American population of Philadelphia. So when Barnes began collecting African art, he was the first major collector in North America to collect African art and material culture. He began collecting in 1924 with the assistance of Paul Guillaume, who was the French dealer who also helped him acquire much of his collection. Guillaume saw that artists like Picasso and Modigliani and others were actually looking at African art and sculpture for inspiration in their modernist projects. And so Guillaume thought, I'll open up a new market and begin importing this stuff as well and selling it alongside to the same collectors who were interested in this progressive painting. So Guillaume introduced Barnes to the collecting of African art and material culture, and Barnes went wild and collected about 250 really remarkable things in the 1920s. By 1925, he had the largest and also most publicly available African art collection in North America. And it was actually several decades before another museum actually mounted a serious exhibition of African art in North America. So Barnes, in the middle of the 1920s, when he opened the foundation in 25 to the public, people became aware that he was integrating this African material into his displays of French modernism. And he came to the attention of a gentleman called Alain Locke, who was a professor of philosophy at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And Locke was the person who famously coined the expression the New Negro in 1925. He was one of the key framers of the project that we call the Harlem Renaissance, which is a kind of embrace of the efflorescence of arts and culture in African American populations, and a kind of as a support for communal pride and political progress, and really it's a kind of proto-civil rights development. Barnes came to his attention because he believed, Locke believed, that in order for African American artists to create a truly African American art, they had to have access to this cultural heritage of which they had been deprived. Right? So now Barnes was not collecting at the outset in service to that idea, but Locke saw this collection, heard about it, came and introduced himself to Barnes, and was invited Barnes to the very first meeting of the organization that ended up being the body that supported and promoted African American artists, poets, and so forth, musicians, and on and on. And Charles Johnson, who was a publisher who worked with Locke to publish Locke's early papers on this idea of the New Negro, framing this idea, wrote in Opportunity magazine of May 1924, after he had been introduced to Barnes by Alain Locke, he wrote, "Soon, primitive Negro art will invade this country as it has invaded Europe, and there will come with it a new valuation of the contribution of Negroes, past and yet possible, to American life and culture. It is on this certainty, that Dr. Barnes has quietly combed Europe for the choicest of the specimens brought from Africa, and is even now urging serious study and exclusive research into the field, still uncharted by competent and interested Negro students." This was so important to the Harlem Renaissance Project that Dr. Barnes was the only person who was not a person of color who contributed to the anthology called The New Negro that gave the movement its name. And he, not surprisingly, wrote about the significance of African art for African American artists in his contribution to that volume. So very key to his project. And we'll find later that Dr. Barnes continued to lean into this. He came back to the United States after his last trip to Paris in 25, and he decided that he would bring Paul Guillaume over, and they would begin organizing programs at the Barnes Foundation that would include African American music, that would include lectures about African art, that would include political conversations led by people like Charles Johnson and Alain Locke, and that he would make these part of the Barnes educational project. And he did, and leaned into this so much that he created a scholarship program. I believe it was the first scholarship program for African-American cultural producers. He gave scholarships to people like Horace Pippin and Gwendolyn Brooks and Langston Hughes and so forth to really booster this movement, to buoy the movement up. And you can see on the right, he has a choir singing here on the steps of the building in Marion, and on the right is a program from one of these Sunday afternoon gatherings with Paul Guillaume giving a talk on African-American sculpture, or African sculpture, his head of education talking about the influence of African sculpture on contemporary art, Charles Johnson talking about reading contemporary Negro poetry, Barnes talking about Black American music, which he was very interested in, and a chorus of who singing spirituals and other Black songs. So Barnes leaning back into this whole history. So Barnes continued to collect this way into the 1940s. There are all kinds of interesting things that happen at the end of his life, including he begins for the first time to collect abstract art, fully abstract art, which is a lesser known part of the story. And you have to invite me back if you're interested in that part of the story, because it's pretty complex. But he continues all of these activities, both the kind of progressive educational project and his support for minority communities in and around Philadelphia up to the time of his death. His personality never changed. So the story about his death is a very interesting one. I find it very telling. In 1951, Dr. Barnes had for several decades owned a beautiful farm in Chester County, 160-acre farm. And when he first bought it, there was no one out there. And over the course of those decades, it became more populous. And so the tiny little road at the top of his driveway finally required a stop sign. You see where this is going. They finally insisted on putting a stop sign at the top of his driveway because the road had become so busy. And of course, Dr. Barnes made a point of actually blowing through the stop sign every time he reached it, just to make a point of it. And during one of these outings, he was involved in a collision with a truck, and that was the end of Dr. Barnes. So that happened in 1951. Subsequent to Barnes' death, and I'll skip past this now, the project, the educational project, and his commitment to these issues in DEAI continued. It was perpetuated first by his wife, who ran the foundation until 1966, while also running the Arboretum. She was a horticulturalist. And then subsequently, the head of education that had been there since the 1930s, ran the foundation until she died in 1988. And then you probably know the subsequent story is much more complex. Flashing forward to 2000, the late 90s and early aughts, it became abundantly clear that the Marion property, which the building in Marion had neither appropriate HVAC for the collection of this value, nor did it have proper security. In fact, you could probably walk into the building at any time, unguarded. A real problem. And that began a conversation about the move to Philadelphia, and of course there are other financial and political dimensions to that story, but that's what really led to the conversation about creating a new facility for it in a place that could accommodate more visitors. In '64, the foundation had been sued by the Inquirer under the leadership of Walter Annenberg, because even though it had won its tax exemption, claiming it was open to the broad public, it had never actually been open to a broad public. You know stories, I'm sure, about applying to get in and how difficult it was to gain access in those years. So things began to open in '64, but the idea of moving to the Parkway was both about building a facility that was appropriate to a collection that at that time was probably worth about $35 billion, and also accommodating a much broader public in service to Barnes' original educational mission. So we moved to the Parkway, and as I said, when we moved to the Parkway, I joined the Barnes 2 years after the move to the Parkway. So happily I missed all of that mess you got. But what attracted me to the Barnes at that time, aside from this extraordinary collection, was the institution's openness, willingness to ask, what does the progressive educational mission look like in the new millennium, right? And what does this commitment to openness, sustainability, access, and so forth, what does that look like, or what should it look like today in Philadelphia? And what we've done subsequently, and I have to say, I've worked with a lot of boards. I've never worked with a better, more cohesive, more aligned, more supportive board ever. Is really digging into the answers to those two questions, and really building a
program array and so forth, and community service program that's really rooted in Barnes' original commitments. So just to give you an idea of some of the things that we are doing today that you know. You may know that Barnes never had a special exhibition program. There was never a temporary exhibition gallery at the foundation in Marion. So when we moved to the Parkway, we built a special exhibition gallery, but there was never an idea that it would be activated all the time with changing exhibitions. So since I arrived in late 2014, we have been organizing year-round special exhibitions that both explore core aspects of the collection, but also explore ideas that are implicit or explicit in Barnes' commitments, right? So we exhibit much work by contemporary African-American artists, for example, including an exhibition we have on view right now. We also very much honor his commitment to promoting women. So we have changing exhibitions, both historical and contemporary work by established great women artists who have been under-recognized. Next summer, Louise Nevelson, for example, the Louise Nevelson show. And then really leaning into some of his more progressive commitments. So this semi-quincentennial season, we were all encouraged, we in the Philadelphia community, of course, were encouraged to organize exhibition programs that really respond to, celebrate, interrogate the implications of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And what we did in honoring Barnes' own commitments is really look at some of the stories that are not so well known. So we have an exhibition, by Sky Lopinka, a Native American artist who just won the MacArthur Genius Grant Award. We have an exhibition of media art by young African American filmmakers and media artists who work with found material to re-narrate their experience. And opening at the end of the summer, we have an exhibition called Noguchi Uesawa, designing post-war America, which looks at, and remarkable, this has never happened before, it looks at the art, architecture, and design of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during the Second World War, and the way in which that experience impacts what they did subsequently. So people like Ruth Osawa and Isamu Noguchi and George Nakashima and so forth. So really alternate stories that we think Barnes would have appreciated, that really elevate stories that have been more marginal to our histories. And then we have really leaned into, looking like the wrong direction, sorry. We have really leaned into ways in which we can reach out, the ways we can reach out reach a much broader public. So some of the things we've done is first evolve the paradigm, this educational paradigm. We now talk about what these things mean in addition to how they're made. So kind of social historical paradigm. When I arrived at the Barnes, of the 3,000 pictures and objects in the collection, we only had 150 complete object files, which means no research had been conducted on any of the other pictures and objects, in part because Barnes wouldn't allow anyone to reproduce any images of the collection in color, so no publishers wanted to publish books with those images in them. But he also disallowed access by art historians because he didn't want his very focused project to be undermined. We have now opened that up. We, with the support of the Pew Charitable Trusts, we have completed research on about 2,100 of those pictures and objects in the last decade, and I hope there'll be more funding to promote that, but then making that new information available. So expanding our adult education program, which serves about 800 people a year, 300 of those people on full scholarships. We have developed a number of digital products, including a distance learning platform where you can now take all the courses we offer on site on our own platform. So if you don't feel like venturing out, it's a great way to support the Barnes. But also creating other kinds of tools which we're now licensing to the field. So we hope Dr. Barnes would appreciate our entrepreneurial spirit, because philanthropy ain't doing it. And then really reaching out to the community in service to his other commitments. So we have access partnerships. Any program that enrolls kids from underserved schools or families from underserved neighborhoods in the city, we give something we call an all access membership pass for a full year. A family or a person and 3 guests, can have all the benefits of free membership to the Barnes Foundation, including discounts, restaurant, and so forth. It's a way for us to continue to develop relationships with parts of our community that we don't typically reach, or museums don't typically reach, or can't call it a museum, foundation, educational foundations don't typically reach, but also a way of creating a dialogue, right? So because we now know who these people are, we can communicate with them all the time. Restorative justice programs, we work with mural arts to do job training in arts and applied arts for recently incarcerated people. We also do art education programs in the Phoenix, the formerly Graterford prison, full-time. We have exhibitions of work in that social justice program. We do the job training, and we're now trying to encourage other cultural institutions in town to give priority to returning citizens in entry-level hourly jobs. We have a program with Patrice Salud, which is English language training using art tools for recently arrived immigrants, Spanish-speaking immigrants to Philadelphia. We work with the People's Emergency Center and other emergency centers around the city to do after-school, weekend, and summer programs for kids in underserved neighborhoods and parks and rec. And finally, we have a Pathways program. We discovered at some point that we were doing all this job training for people who were outside of the Barnes family. And someone said to me, well, you know, we have all these entry-level hourly employees who can also benefit from this. So we created an internal paid internship program for our own employees. So anyone that works at the Barnes can do a semester-long training program in any one of the other departments in the Barnes, paid internship, to sort of acquaint themselves with other pathways forward in the cultural space. And our biggest triumph so far is a young woman who was an hourly security guard, who is now the head of social media for SEPTA, and she did this through her training program at the Barnes Foundation. So, and on and on and on. We continue to ask ourselves what more we can do in service to our regional community that is true to Barnes' original commitments. And that takes us all the way back to the beginning of the story, those commitments all being rooted in, I think, really Barnes' early childhood experience and the exposures that his mother gave him. A really kind of remarkable story, and I'll stop yammering now, we can talk about the scandal and outrage. I forgot to mention, we just opened Calder Gardens too. That's also a Barnes project. If you've not been, please do come visit us at Calder Gardens as well. Please.
I have a question. When you were talking about the early times of it, you starting to collect and all that, it just kind of reminds me of that phrase, I don't know anything about art, but I know what I like.
Yes.
So.
Well, the comment was, this reminds me, this posture that we can't expect anyone to come prepared to actually really read these pictures in the way they've been written, but I know what I like. Well, this is, I mean, it's really very close, right? We know now the word aesthetic refers to the way in which the world registers on the body through the senses. And then through that, of course, we develop emotional and intellectual and also physiological responses to aesthetics. We know increasingly this to be the case. So it is true, whether it's knowing exactly, it's a certain kind of knowing. Your body knows, you have an emotional, neurological response, and so forth. So it is right there. Well, he knew this, right? I mean, Barnes was a scientist. So he was aware, even at this early moment, that there was, of course, that aesthetics had a neurological component. So you're right.
Yeah, thank you.
It seems like his commitment to African Americans in the United States was sincere in educating them. And I'm wondering about his collection of native African art as opposed to sort of looking for American African artists and trying to elevate them as well.
So this is a good question. So you've been to the collection, you may have recognized that while we have a lot of African art in material culture, we don't have a lot of African American art. In fact, we have precious few examples of work by some of the people that he sponsored for scholarships, like Horace Pittman, for example. He believed that it was so soon after Reconstruction, it was Barnes' idea, that so soon after Reconstruction, there couldn't possibly be a synthetic and uniquely African American art. So he thought the best thing they could do was not to collect, just disparate examples of this work he thought wasn't fully baked, but rather to collect work and make it accessible to artists who were studying to actually create a truly integral and synthetic African American art. This was his rationalization.
Did he listen to jazz music?
He was a huge music fan. When you went to the main gallery at Barnes, and on the right, you walk into the first gallery, there's a little console there, and that's actually his stereo. he had a huge music collection. He could listen to everything, spirituals, he listened to jazz, he listened to experimental classical music, he listened to everything. He was very interested in music traditions in the American South, for example. He sponsored ethnomusicological surveys of African American music. So he had a huge record collection, and he would play music in conjunction with these in-gallery lessons. And he would try to get people to identify the relationship between, for example, the structure in a Bach partita and a painting by De Chirico. So again, all the senses, not just visual.
The jazz kind of, I'm not a musical
The jazz
historian,
thing?
but yeah, I mean, isn't that uniquely, that's considered, I thought, uniquely American, so it sort of
Yes.
counters his argument
Yes.
that you had to have sort of the origin of.
Well, I'm not saying it's a credible argument. I mean, he had a lot of strong opinions, and music was not his principal concern. So I don't think the idea that there was impurity, I use the word purity, but you know what I mean. I say integral. There couldn't be an African American art with integrity yet. It's too soon. He wasn't that interested in the sort of musical roots, only in the ethnomusicology. So, but he did collect. He loved jazz music. He didn't sponsor any jazz concerts, though. He only sponsored performances of African American music that could be tied to the American South and through that to African tradition. So, yes, he was a complex guy, contradictory and contrarian, and not warm and fuzzy.
So you made a reference to the documentary. You're talking about Art of the Steel.
Yes.
Could you say your top criticisms of that? What is it about that really is problematic?
Yeah, I think it's nonsense. The idea that, first of all, there are two fallacies. There are lots of fallacies in it, but there are two key fallacies. One, by the way, I love this movie because every time somebody watches it on an American Airlines flight, they come to the barn, so it's fine. Just spell my name right. So there are two fallacies. The one fallacy is that somehow the collection was owned by Lincoln University, and it was stolen from Lincoln University. Never. So it was always an independent private foundation, the Barnes Foundation, established in 1922 as an educational foundation. And towards the end of Barnes' life, as he became increasingly unhappy with he was always rebuffed by mainline society. Every move he made was rebuffed. So at a certain point, and then the neighbors started going after him, and when the Barnes Foundation started containing school groups and so forth, so that was really irritating to him. And to be fair to him, he had always been supporting HBCUs. So he had a long relationship with Lincoln through Horace Mann Bond, right? So that was a real relationship, and Lincoln was the first HBCU, right? So he had a real relationship with Lincoln. He sponsored lectures there, he sponsored professorships. So there was a real connection to Lincoln, but he also used it as a threat. So when the neighbors, for example, said they were going to sue him because they didn't want school buses parking on Latches Lane, he said, great, I'm going to give it to Lincoln University and they can turn it into an extension campus for Lincoln University. And then everybody stopped complaining about buses. So there was a little tension there, right? So he had a real relationship with Lincoln, he was really supportive of Lincoln and other HBCUs and their projects, but he also used his relationship with the African American community when it was politically expedient. So that's the one thing. So the first fallacy was owned by Lincoln. Toward the end of his life, when he was constantly working as a state plan, you probably know this. At the end of his life, he election loyal sort of in the mid-30s, I think. He decided that the foundation would never need to raise money, it would never need to operate as a kind of public trust, it would never need to charge admission, because he had set up an investment fund for it, which was, wait for it, all government bonds. Would be enough money, right? They would never have to raise money or do anything. So he thought he just needed a governing board after his death that would continue to perpetuate his project. So he made Lincoln the entity that appointed the 5 members of that original board. So that was another gesture in that direction, but again, a kind of empty gesture because he really thought there was nothing to govern, and he also thought there was not going to be any kind of real burden on that board. It was really kind of he had a board. So he had a very small board, and it was all appointed by Lincoln. So that's the Lincoln connection.
Lincoln, and then of course the board was later expanded beyond Lincoln appointees. But that's the first fallacy, is that somehow the collection was owned by Lincoln, and then this cabal stole the collection. It was always its own separately incorporated. That's the first fallacy. And the second fallacy is that Ed Rendell, pause, that Ed Rendell, the Pew Charitable Trusts, who else was involved? William Penn Foundation, all got together and bought this thing because they wanted to possess it, they wanted to control this thing. And in fact, the idea that the foundation needed to be kind of rebooted in its governance began in '64 with this Annenberg lawsuit where they had to open up to a wider public. And then there were many iterations of this. So then, the '94 tour was prompted by a court permission to do that. That was prompted by fiscal challenges. So they sent the collection on a 2.5-year tour, made millions of dollars, which was supposed to be used to upgrade the building, to create the security and environmental controls I mentioned. This never happened. So it's a fallacy when you think about it. The governor, well, the mayor, and the two biggest foundations in town were going to get together because they needed to steal this asset from this poor HBCU. It's absurd. It's an absurdity. I mean, the project was really generated in the private sector. The private sector then organized itself to attract resources from William Penn and Pew Charitable Trust and so forth. And that's how it worked. And that's when the board was expanded to 15 beyond Lincoln by many appointees. So, and there are all